So finally, our first steps in Houdini. Now, this video is more like a crash course. So we want to talk about the interface, but don't worry, I don't want to go through all of the things here because frankly, it's pretty boring. We will learn all the stuff that we need while we go. This is more to get a first, most important information about how to deal with all this. Mainly what you have is three elements. You have the viewport, which is just like in other 3D programs, and you use it by the standard of the industry, which is Alt, and then the mouse buttons. Just try it out. You will be very familiar, especially when you come from something like Maya. Then here, just like in Nuke, and this is why Nuke is so helpful to know beforehand, you have a network view, and then just like in Nuke, up here you have it's called a parameter window. So you have the settings of the nodes you create. So you orient yourself in the network view the same way as you do in the viewport. So you can use the same logic with your mouse buttons. And it makes more sense when we create a node first. It works just like in Nuke with the tab menu, and then you can just type in what you want. In our case, we want light. And the search is pretty good, so you don't have to exactly know what the name of the node is, but if you know some part of it, you will usually find it. So light, there it is, and we have now a representation of the light in the viewport as well. When you middle click in the network view, you can move around again, just like in the viewport. And when you select a node up here, like I said, in the parameter window, you see the settings of that particular node. Careful, please, this is called a parameter window. And I know in Maya, this would be called an attribute window, but be careful with the names here. An attribute in Houdini is something completely different, and we will talk about this later. So let's make sure we are careful about the words. This is parameters. So the settings of a node, those kind of controllers here, those are parameters. So just like in other 3D programs, you have now two ways of controlling this thing, in this case a light. You can either change certain numbers here in the parameter window. For example, I move it by 1 in X or something, whatever I want to change, the brightness and so on. Or many things can be controlled in the viewport. And to do that, I have to move my mouse into the viewport, and then I can press enter, and then I'm in the edit mode. And here I can change, the standard stuff like doesn't make sense for a light, but I can change the rotation and the position. And later on, we will see with other objects, you can change different things. But as you can see, when I change in the viewport, of course, I change the parameters with it. Now, currently we are on the object level. And what you should remember in the beginning is certain nodes can only be created on in certain contexts, in certain areas. And since we are on the object level, you basically create the three most important things you create on the object level are lights and also cameras, so camera, and later on a geometry node, which is basically an empty container where we will work inside of most of the time. But for now, let's talk about cameras. So I can create a new camera, and just like before, if I move my mouse in, and I'm still in the edit mode, that's why we see all this stuff. But if I press enter, I can control the camera directly in the viewport, which can be quite helpful. I can also, if I want to change the parameters, or just like in every other 3D program, I can look through that camera. And I can do this up here where it says no camera right now, because currently we're not looking through any camera. So let's switch that to the camera we just created called Cam1. And now we see what we see through the camera. Now what's special about Houdini, which is really cool, is as soon as I move my mouse now, and you can see that as soon as you raise your finger from the button, you basically jump out of the camera. So when you move around while looking through a camera, very often you jump out of it and don't change the camera, which is the beauty of it. So you don't accidentally change your angle if that's, for example, a render camera. Now, sometimes, of course, you want that. So let's jump back into the camera. And the way of turning this on and off is this little key lock here. So if I turn this on, now whenever I change my view, I change the camera with it. If I turn it off, I will always jump out of the camera as soon as I change my perspective. And this can be really helpful, especially if, again, you have a camera that is meant for rendering. So to get out of the edit mode, we can just press escape. Now let's talk about the third one that we created, and that is the geometry node, which again, you can just find by typing in geo, for example, and there it is. And this is just an empty container, and this is very important because we will most of the time work inside of a geometry node. And you can get inside of this actually by pressing enter or double clicking on the node. And as you can see now, we're now on the geometry level. And here is where we create our geometry. This is where we work most of the time. And this is actually also called a SOP level. It stands for surface operators. So here is where we can create nodes, which is another word for operators, that create or deform or modify or change or whatever surface geometry. That is actually not true because there's a lot of geometry that is not made of a surface, but this is the logic behind it. Most of the time, I would say like 95% of the time we work on this level. Now, let's create something. For example, we can create here a cube, or you can create a sphere, or you can create a test geometry. We will talk about this later. And one of them is, for example, the rubber toy, which I like personally. And currently you can't see much. He is a bit dark. And the reason is that we created a light. So let's make sure that the light is currently not influencing our scene. And we can do this with this button here. So that basically turns on the default light, or we turn on the lights in our scene. This can be very helpful. What we also could have done is we just could go back to our object level by just clicking here on this address bar, and then maybe just delete the light and the camera by pressing delete. Now let's go back to our geometry 1, and as you can see, this is a way of showing where we are right now. If we go back to the object level and then go back into geometry 1, it shows us that we are now on the object level, and after that we went to geometry 1. So this up here is quite important, especially if we have more than 2 levels. Now what you might have noticed is that we created a box and a sphere and a test geometry, but we only see the test geometry. Why is that? Because it's a node-based system, just like in Nuke, you only see the currently active node and what comes out of it. And this can be changed with the very right button, the blue one. And if you click on your node on the very right button, this becomes the activated node or the displayed node. We'll talk about this later, just keep that in mind. That you can switch between the nodes and switch what's displayed in the viewport. Of course, we will talk about this in much more detail later on, but for now, so that you're not confused, if you're wondering why you can only look at the result of one single node, there is a merge node that you can create to, literally merge the result of multiple nodes together. And this way you can see the combination of multiple nodes, as long as you, of course, have your display flag activated for this merge node. But we will talk about all this in much more detail later on. Now, as you can see, for some reason, our viewport is now a bit on the side. That sometimes happens. And to return to our base look, basically, we can press H, and that will kind of give us show us everything in our scene. It stands for home. Another way of doing something similar is to press F, just like in other 3D programs, because it focuses on the currently selected node. So H and F, quite important. Then the next thing is different view angles. So just like in other 3D programs, you can switch between a top angle and a side angle and so on. And in Houdini, you do that with, you can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it's safer to use space 1, which shows us our perspective view, then space 2, which is from the top, space 3 from the front, space 4 from the side. And this is very important now. Space 5 shows us our UV window or UV map. Now this is pretty important because there is actually no UV editor in Houdini directly. This works over the viewport. So remember, space 5 brings you to your UV window. Let's go back with space 1 to our perspective view. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the display options. So you get there with the key D, easy to remember, and this is surprisingly important in Houdini. So this is not something that you change once and then you keep it for 2 weeks, but this is actually where you change a lot of visualizations and how the viewport is presented to you depending on the case. So it's very common that you change this often during the day, depending on what you're working on right now. We will talk about a lot of this, so I will skip this now, but let's talk about the background at least. The background allows you to change the background. So up here, the color scheme is important because depending on what you're working on, sometimes it's easier to see in front of dark or a gray or the light that we saw before, which is a bluish with a gradient in it. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is how you present your 3D object in the viewport. Currently, it looks just like that, as a shaded version, and we can't really see the faces. But up here, you can change how your geometry is presented. For example, as a wireframe or as a flat shaded, so that you see the facets. Also, there's a smooth shaded, and there is a smooth shaded with a wire on it. And it's actually easy to switch between them without this button. You can just remember wireframe, which is W. So you press W to switch between the wireframe, and then you can use Shift W to switch between the wired on shaded. Those are the two I use the most. So W and Shift W when you're in the shaded mode to turn on the grid on top if you want. And then finally, maybe let's turn off the grid in the viewport overall, because sometimes you want that, sometimes it's annoying. And this is on the very top on the right side here. You can turn this on and off. Talking about the toolbar here, there's actually a hidden toolbar in the viewport on the very left side. If you click on the first of the bars, be careful not to click on the very left, because that's another thing we talk about in a second. And here you can use a couple of functions like selecting elements of your geometry, or moving or rotating, or the edit mode we already talked about. We will talk about this later on, but just for now, keep in mind that there are a couple more hidden tools on this toolbar here on the left. Okay, so this was quite a lot, I know, but don't worry, we will use all of this during the course. And if you kind of want to remind yourself, you can always come back to this video. So for now, I hope this was helpful. See you in another video. Cheers.